Sì.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paolo di Tommaso. Mrs. Mavelli already introduced me. I'm an architect and I deal with urban regeneration and architectural regeneration and reclaim. I thank Mrs. Mavelli for inviting me. I really I think that her YouTube channel is really very interesting and intriguing. I believe that these subjects are so topical, and I think that they really allow us to look ahead into the future. This conference is essentially about the relationship between ethics and aesthetics. Now, since I'm an architect, I will try to deal with this topic with particular reference to my job. So with what I do every day, I mean, doing my job every day, I always work here in the island of Capri. Of course, my work allows me to stay and work within the architectural setting of the island of Capri. So I must tell you something about this setting and this context. Essentially, the architectural heritage of the island of Capri, so to say, originates from the hybridation and intertwining of three worlds. The ancient world, which was a world of peasants and fishermen, the dwellers of Capri. These inhabitants, the early inhabitants, gave birth to the so-called vernacular architecture. This vernacular architecture, I mean the Capri architectural island, arises from three cultural worlds. And this vernacular architecture meets the other architecture, the academic architecture, which is the architecture that developed in the early 20th century, by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And this is the so-called architecture of reinterpretation, because at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, some technicians, Edwin Cerio was really an outstanding figure among them, they studied the Capri vernacular architecture. So they sort of worked out a semiological code, and then they tried to reinterpret these architectural elements, this architectural heritage. And they range from the end of the 18th century to the early years of the 20th century. Now, behind the scenes of this reinterpretation architecture, it was inspired by many foreigners who came here and stayed in Naples, actually in Capri. The French, the British, the Swiss, also the Swedish came to Capri and stayed here. And they thought to build their mansions. When they built their mansions, they sort of imported the style of their own countries, original countries, or their homeland. But somehow their buildings were influenced by the vernacular architecture, but in their turn, they again influenced the vernacular architecture too. Now, looking at the details and features of these three types of architecture, it is important to look at these features, because you can then understand what is the role played by ethics and aesthetics in my work. As to the vernacular architecture, well, this was an architecture which was developed by the autochthonous dwellers, so to say, so peasants and fishermen. Peasants used these small, very simple houses which were built in their fields, the fields they would cultivate, where they would grow crops. So these were not, of course, small towns or villages. This was just, so to say, sort of clusters of houses, Caterola and in Capri, Capodimonte and Porta, where the locations, La Catena, are these sort of neighborhood or locations where peasants built their houses. Now, this architecture of peasants was matched by or accompanied by fishermen's architecture. Fishermen, very much in the same way as peasants, they built their houses close to the sea. So the first, so to say, dwellers, the early dwellers, aggregated in Marina Piccola and Capri. As to vernacular architecture, they would refer to sort of functional typologies. Actually, some peasants used these houses, sort of cluster or exchequer shaped or like houses. I mean, these houses formed a sort of an exchequer, and they sort of adapted themselves to the configuration of the soil, of the land. As to the building typology of the fishermen's houses, they used the building typology was there were sort of tenement houses, so to say. They were built in a row, facing the sea, and they had these monazziri, big rooms, big premises, which were on the floor. I mean, at the first floor level, or at the ground level, better. These big premises, large premises, allowed to keep there the fishing net and the boat and whatever was needed for their job. The essential key characteristic and feature of this vernacular architecture was that, first of all, they were all built with stone bearing structures and domes or arches. And the arches were sort of elliptic arch-shaped structures, or rarely pavilion-shaped gavetta arch. The feature of these two typologies was that their windows were very small. We always find very small windows. Because of the climate, of course, the houses had to be protected from cold at winter and heat in summer. They were not very much decorated, but the only decorative element were some chimneys, some benches, stone benches, and some colonnade. Masonry colonnades, which were then covered with pergole, with plants or ivy. So these are the characteristics of vernacular architecture. We should say that this kind of architecture has been in Capri, has been developed in Capri from the Roman time down to the late 19th century. So this was the predominant architecture. And the only materials which were found in Capri were exclusively used, were used both for building houses and for building churches. For example, we have the most ancient churches are built with bearing structures in masonry and covered with a vault, with a dome. Sant'Anna in the other churches in Capri. Many scholars have tried to explain why the vaults were very much used in the vernacular architecture in Capri. And they tried to explain this widespread use by pointing to the climate or to aesthetics, personally, I believe that the widespread use of these vaults and these domes was due to the fact that in Capri no other building material could be found. I mean, the scholars just invented the fact or thought that the vaults and the domes are used for the climate, because of the climate. But actually, the exclusive use of vaults is due to the fact that in Capri there were no other building materials. Capri is isolated from the mainland. So the only way in which the Capri inhabitants could build and then cover spaces were the stone which was found here, which was used together with mortar, and the technique derived from the Roman technique. The Romans, when they built their important imperial mansions, brought to the island this building technique for vaults. So this technique has also always been used. And this building technique has been used for thousands of years, up to the early 19th century, when the ferry boats allowed to bring here pig iron elements and other building materials. Now, this vernacular architecture, as I said, there is this reinterpretation or revisiting architecture, and the most outstanding representative of this architecture was Edwin Cerio, which developed from the mid-19th century up to the 60s. Edwin Cerio, by studying the vernacular architecture of this place, worked out a semantic code. He understood that this vernacular architecture repeated and reiterated always the same semantic code. And these technicians have tried to propose this kind of architecture, which was used for new buildings mainly, but also to refurbish and repair already existing buildings. And together with this kind of architecture, there is this so-called eclectic architecture, which was produced by many foreigners who've been staying here in Capri since the early 19th century. I mean, through colonies, communities of foreigners decided to stay here in Capri, and when they decided, they decided also to build their houses. These houses and mansions were inspired by their countries of origin style, but in building them, they anyhow tried to mix this style up with the vernacular architecture. And this gave rise to the typically Capri style. Together with that, other architectures of the Anjou's period, Anjou kings period, like the Chartres of San Giacomo, and also the some other monasteries in Capri and Anacapri, together with the buildings built in the 60s to meet the demands of both Capri dwellers and second house residents. Now, all this together make up the heritage, the built heritage of Capri, of the island of Capri. This heritage held an exceptional aesthetic value, which together with the landscape of Capri certainly gave rise to one of the, made up one of the landscapes that are one of the most beautiful in the world. Edwin Cerio was not only an engineer, he also became the mayor of Capri. He was famous because he was the first one who promoted the first conference on landscape. He was the first one who decided to organize this conference on landscape. Now, the architectural heritage, together with the natural landscape, the natural beauty of this landscape, of high aesthetic value, created this wonderful landscape of Capri, which is certainly one of the most beautiful in the world. Now, in 1922, the first conference was held on landscape, and it helped to pass the first law on landscape. At that point, the Capri Island was listed as one of the national beauties and protected territory. So the first constraints were passed and imposed upon the inhabitants of the island. Up to the end of the 60s, we could build in Capri. We could build, yes, but you needed permits from the superintendency of the archaeological and natural heritage. Now, after that law was passed, further constraints were provided. So these constraints prohibited any construction work. So from 1968 to 1975, when the Galasso law was passed, they were at the first time they were temporary, then they became absolute. Final and definitive. These very strict constraints that are shared by other wonderful sites, wonderful landscapes in Italy. Now, such constraints sort of triggered a phenomenon which is called the phenomenon of illegal building, illicit building. The owners of these houses started to build in a very disorderly way. So the aesthetic value of these buildings, which was remarkable in the beginning, then deteriorated gradually. We know very well that the aesthetic value of an estate is very important because it also has an impact upon the landscape, but it's important to regenerate building in a very aesthetic way. So if the buildings are regenerated in an aesthetic way and fashion, then also the territory enjoys this kind of regeneration and aesthetic regeneration. Now, having said that, let us now shift to the way in which I deal with this and enter in a relationship with this aesthetic value in my job. Very often it happens to me that I must work on buildings that from the aesthetic view are not very nice, are not very beautiful, because the owners have added new buildings, so the aesthetic value has been impaired. New spaces have been built. So very often, more often than not, we should subtract, we must demolish these added spaces. For example, some green spaces were occupied by buildings, but in order for us to be able to do that, we must convince and persuade the owners, because an aesthetic retrieval and regeneration of a building certainly implies an ethical choice. So the first step in our work is that of persuading the owners and convincing them that the aesthetic regeneration and this sort of renewal is a duty, a moral duty for citizens and for the whole community. Now, I should conclude by making a few remarks. What do we understand from all this? Well, in architecture, ethics and aesthetics are both sides of the same coin. Are the two sides of the same coin. In our specific case, the ethical component comes ahead and beforehand, but in the end they form a whole. One more remark. An architectural building always holds an ethical value, because an architectural work, an architectural building always holds an ethical value, because regardless of those who build it, be it a private or a public person or a body, it does have a civic value, and for that reason only, it already is endowed with an ethical value. Furthermore, the architecture contributes to landscape. So the landscape as an heritage has both an aesthetic and an ethical value. So we architects working in this island, on this island, I mean, since we became aware of the need to regenerate buildings in an aesthetic way, we hope that these interventions and these developments, new developments, happen more frequently, and we hope that the municipalities will help us in this mission, so to say. I should say that the local government and local communities have become aware of the importance of this work, but of course also the ministry and the superintendencies should help us in this direction. So this must not be erratic as an intervention, but it must become a custom. Thank you for your attention.